First of all, I'd like to say how pleased I am to be here and to be part of what I think are really important deliberations here at Hampshire College. And what is also, I think, not only an essential, but an exciting and a critical moment for thinking about the role of the humanities in contemporary culture and how to teach the humanities in the college curriculum. So I began my thinking with Karen's notes, which she sent to me, and that sent me off actually on a Google search, which is how we all start research these days, for recent contributions to the discussion on the crisis in the humanities. And I found a very interesting blog entry by a librarian at Princeton, Wayne Bivens Tatum, which he posted in 2010, in which he had traced the talk of crisis in the humanities in academic journals back to 1922. So he found, in fact, that there had been a sense of crisis in the humanities for as long as there have been departments of humanities in colleges and universities. This I thought really interesting, and it confirmed something that I had been thinking about in relationship to my own discipline, which is the history of architecture and urban form, which, like other disciplines in the humanities, has perceived itself as being in crisis for some time now. And in fact, as I discovered when I went through the Journal of Record of Architectural History, which is the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, some years ago when I was thinking about the history of that journal, and I discovered that the talk of crisis in the history of architecture seems to resurface at regular intervals, and actually just about every 20 years or so. So it's sort of we cycle through these moments of crisis and sort of every 20 years or so, it's time for a new crisis. And that led me to think that a sense of crisis seems to be endemic to the humanities. And I think, though, in a very positive way, and especially those humanities which are concerned with history. And I would guess that basically all of them are in some way concerned with history, since historical thinking is very much a part of the humanities. So I asked myself, why is this? Is it because the humanities are constantly embattled? Is it because science and technology always seem so much more important because their innovations and discoveries seem to have direct practical application and those in the humanities don't? When I was pondering these issues in relationship to architectural history, again, research, I turned to one of the great materialist historians of architecture, the Italian Manfredo Tafuri, for some insight. And I found it in his introduction to The Sphere and the Labyrinth, which is a history of the avant-gardes in architecture, which was published in 1980 in Italian. And Tafuri is translated into English, but not until about 10 years later. Tafuri wrote of his own project in writing history, in that particular history. As he said, the historical project is always a project of crisis, in the sense that it is never definitive and always provisional. And also because it ceaselessly questions its own materials and methods, and therefore it reconstructs them, the materials and methods, and continuously reconstructs itself. Now, a number of things seem really interesting to me in this, and I believe also speak to the role of historical thinking and the humanities in higher education. The first is the conception of history. Oh my God, I hope that's not mine. I think it might be. No, it's not, sorry, but just in case.
Had to happen.
It had to happen.
wake up.
Yeah, exactly. This is where we're getting into the meat and potatoes here. The conception of history as a project, as projective, that projects backwards, but also forwards and is actively shaped, that is about understanding change and therefore is as much about the present and the future as it is about the past. And I think this point was made very succinctly by Otto Neurath, who is a Viennese philosopher of modernity, when he said, if we stay exclusively in the present, we will very soon only be able to understand the past. And the second interesting point of Tafuri's, I think, is the concept of history as a project that is permanently in crisis, that is in transition, that is unstable and dynamic. And I think that crisis conceived in this way is a very good thing. It's not only a sign of vitality and resistance, but it is a critical habit of mind, and it is also a fundamental condition of historical thinking. And it seems logical, I would say, that a discipline whose project is to understand change must actually repeatedly throw itself into crisis and be self-questioning. The third factor is that the notion of history as project implies that the production of history itself is a practice that is self-critical. And it constitutes a body of knowledge that is not only constantly being shaped and reshaped, but that can be shaped and is shaped in very different ways, that there are many different histories about the same events. And that's something that I admire Ken Burns' films for so much, that he is able to bring in so many different stories that are shaping history and that are giving it many different kinds of shapes. So the question, I guess, is how to integrate that into teaching. The obvious way that we all do is through history courses, but I think that there's another way, actually, that I've been experimenting with over the last few years, which is in involving students in actual research, in primary research. In engaging students in historical thinking through research, which today, actually really importantly, and I think that we have to consider this when we're talking about the humanities, that it means working with new digital tools and resources that are available for humanities research. There's, as we all know, an almost infinite amount of information available, but we need to teach students how to use it critically, how to apply, as I would say, the critical habits of mind that are part of historical thinking, and to teach them how to process information to produce knowledge, because information is not knowledge. They're not the same thing. And that, I think, is a very important point as well. Another way, I think, aside from engaging in research, and we could talk about that later about how one does that in the context of an academic program, but also experimenting with different formats for architectural knowledge, ways of shaping and sharing architectural knowledge in different media, digital media that tend to make all other media actually accessible. And I've been working with students in doing mapping, for instance, and various kinds of mapping that you can now do to visualize change in a spatial way. And you can use these things interactively to share information, obviously through photography and through film and archival materials, photography and film and so on. And many of these, of course, are available online. And I think it's important to bring all of us into this act of engaging with history in terms of telling stories and constructing narratives and actually making them freely accessible as well. But I think that one of the important points in all of this, as we are all enthralled by technology, but the starting point should be in humanistic research or in humanities research should be historical, social, political, and cultural questions. The tools themselves don't produce knowledge. We need to use them to help understand the major issues and questions of the day. But we need to set the agenda And then we have to figure out how to make those tools, how to get those tools to help us answer some of the questions that we feel are really important. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Eve. I'm going to talk a little later about Google and labyrinths, so I'll get to both of those themes from your remarks. All of you in the audience know the tune. We all dance to it every day. Educational costs are high, revenues are low, the economy sucks. Faculty, students, and trustees want. Faculty want to teach fewer courses. Students want to take more courses. Trustees want sustainability, and they want it now. What's a college to do? The usual approach is to determine what's on the table and what's not. We all know some of those things that are on the table at some of our schools: tenure, financial aid, athletics. I know you've gotten rid of most of those here. By this,
we never had them to begin with.
I know, we never, exactly, never to begin with. What's a college to do, as I say? By this calculation of what's on the table and what's not, less is always less. Could we possibly be more creative? Could we pose the question in another way? Are there any guides from the past who can help us? We are gathered here today to celebrate an inauguration, starting points, moments of creative and groundbreaking invention, the kind of thing Hampshire College has built into its reputation, its image. Where do we start? Where do we begin? My theme for the next 5 or 10 minutes will be starting from zero. As I thought of this occasion at this college, I kept hearing Jerome Liebling's voice in his distinctive synthesis of affection and irony. Jerry shaking his head and saying, "Classy, classy, classy." I wonder if Jerry said something similar to his star pupil, Ken Burns. I had the good fortune to work with Jerry on his wonderful photographic documentation of Emily Dickinson, our great cultural resource in the Valley. It was Emily Dickinson's sexy simplicity that particularly appealed to Jerry, a quality that aligned in his fertile imagination with the sexy simplicity of the Bauhaus and the Shakers and the photographers of the WPA. Jerry was a modernist with a social conscience, someone who believed deeply in what the eye and the hand and the imagination could accomplish together. We both liked Emily Dickinson's great haiku hymn to the imagination, to how little it takes for the imagination to make something. The poem is 5 lines long. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and 1 bee. 1 clover and a bee and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. Just before Jerry's death, my wife and I bought a new house in South Amherst, not far from here, a modernist house built in 1954, the same year I was built. Of course, the first thing we discovered is that while the house is modernist in style with flat roof, walls of glass, Japanese eaves, Frank Lloyd Wright built-ins, and so on, it's actually an antique, like me, and now has, of course, new windows, new screens, new boiler, new kitchen. You can hear the cash register in the background, ching, ching, ching. We find ourselves in a similar relation to the great American experiment in progressive education. Remember, progressive education. And here we run up against a surprising paradox. When was the last great period of creativity and experimentation in American higher ed? The answer is the Depression. I find that most of the schools that have defined my life were founded during depressions. Guilford College and Mount Holyoke, my alma mater and my longtime employer, were founded during the Depression of 1837. The Putney School, where Jonathan Lash and I attended high school, was founded during the 1930s when its working farm made good economic sense. The Great Depression gave us Bennington, where the performing arts first entered the curriculum, and the Great Depression gave us Black Mountain College, the astonishing experiment in the mountains of North Carolina that gave us John Cage and Merce Cunningham, Robert Rauschenberg and Cy Twombly, Buckminster Fuller and Charles Olson, and, well, just about everybody I care about in the American culture of the 1940s and 1950s. What made those schools so vital? I think it was that the profit motive was so distant that it barely entered the picture. These schools knew that the traditional methods of education had been a bust, both creatively and economically. Progressive schools like Black Mountain did not start with the question so urgent in higher education today, what can be cut? They started with the question, where do we start? That was the question posed at Hampshire College 40 plus years ago when my brother attended Hampshire as a classmate briefly of Ken Burns. My brother came to Hampshire because it was, as he often said, the Black Mountain College of our time. The question of 40 years ago needs to be posed again, where do we start? At Black Mountain College, the great weaver and textile artist Annie Albers, exiled from the Bauhaus in Germany, developed a classroom exercise that she called, quote, starting at zero. Something should be reversed in teaching, Annie wrote in her shaky English. We always start from what there is today and try to explain it, while I was trying to put the students on absolute zero in the desert. Nothing is there. What is the first thing you have to think of? Maybe, for instance, something for fishing or something for the roof. You gradually develop something, inventions as you go along. And some of the students like also the idea of not being told a brick is done like this and we build it like this. But how do we arrive at the brick? End of quote. I love that last question. How do we arrive at the brick? At least once in life, Annie Albers liked to say, at least once in life, it's good to start at zero. Annie, by the way, was my great aunt, my grandmother's big sister. Annie's husband, Joseph Albers, put it differently. Albers thought students did way too much research and not enough search. Think of it this way. Where do our students start today? As Eve reminded us, they start with Google. A very different number than zero. Almost the opposite of zero. Our students are led to believe that all questions have answers. Our students, in fact, don't need more research. They almost need to learn how to de-search. To put it differently, our students today, and we ourselves are students, have too many ways of not getting lost. GPS, iPhone, Google, Facebook, all of the little beepings we hear as we sit here. What we, their teachers, have to offer instead is a curriculum. A curriculum is not a set of straight paths to careers. It is not a set of well-traveled paths, well mapped by the college. A curriculum is or ought to be a labyrinth to get safely lost in. It's a place to start, starting from zero. Thank you.
I don't have formal remarks, but I've been asked to respond. I'm not sure what I can add. I could reassure Eve to let her know that the Latin motto of Hampshire College is non satiscire, to know is not enough, which connects. And a couple of dots that I might connect for Chris is that the philosopher Jacob Needleman talking about the Shakers in a film that we made on that, some film that got Jerry very passionately involved in in the Shakers said that America is the land of zero. We start from zero. This is the great genius of America. We start with our own reason, our own longing, our own search. And I thought that that ties in very nicely to what you've said. I also have a 7-year-old who, when she was 3, asked me, you know, I told her that I loved her infinity, and she said, was there anything bigger than infinity? And I said, no. And she said, what's the biggest number? And I said, Google. And then she called me in the next night and she said, there's a bigger number than Google. It's old zero. My 3-year-old said, it's old zero. And yeah. So I think this is sort of, we must all be on the same wavelength. Old zero. I'm glad that Lewis Mumford is part of this equation. I got to know him in the last 10 years of his life. He was sort of central in helping us make sense of the first film, really, after Hampshire on the Brooklyn Bridge. And I think, you know, we set aside crisis for a second. I think that in some ways we almost perpetually in the humanities and arts have, at least when we think of ourselves conceptually, have our head up our asses in a sort of very interesting self-regard. What was so great about Mumford was that he integrated things, as did Jerry. They both had a kind of passion and an insistence on sort of integrating lots of different disciplines and not getting lost in specialism and asking sort of very tough questions that actually produce search and not research. And we're probing things about sexuality as well as urbanism, about psychology as well as photography. And all of those things, I think, were part of the soup that I've come out of. You know, I was in here in the fall of 1971 for the first time. I was 18 years old. That is just, I'm now a grandfather. This is what I know. We're all going to die. And that part of what we do as human beings in response to this chaotic fact and a universe which is chaotic is we superimpose narrative over it. We superimpose a frame. We superimpose a story that makes sense. Honey, how was your day? Does not begin. I backed slowly down the driveway, avoiding the garbage can at the curb, pulled into the street, went up to the stop sign, turned the blinker on. You would never tell a story that way unless you got hit by a car right then. But we are always superimposing not just art and the humanities, but faith, rationalism, science, many things over them. And so the very nature of narrative is in itself crisis. I just finished a film, and rather than tell you what the film is, I could tell you what it was about. And it was about right-wing, single-issue political campaigns that metastasize with horrible unintended consequences. It was about the demonization of recent immigrants to the United States. It was about unfunded congressional mandates. It was about smear campaigns against Democratic presidential candidates. It was about a whole group of people who felt like they'd lost control of their country and wanted to take it back. Now, the film is not about the current state of things, but in fact about prohibition. And these were all of the things. You know, Ecclesiastes said, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. So it is for every discipline, not just the humanities and the arts, but for every discipline, a sense of perpetual crisis, because we're all dealing with that sense of mortality. But for us, I think because we feel a little bit back on our heels, that we feel this kind of urgency to sort of bring it up and talk about it. And I'd say that we're, in our own ways, as responsible for that as anything. I don't think we have actively made our case. And part of it has to do with extraordinarily intelligent things that Eve and Chris have said about how we enjoin the tools and the materials of our what's handed to us, of the chaos that we have, and what are the kind of stories we're going to tell. That's all that I'm in the business of, is trying to tell a story and make a sense of what all of this chaos is, which is utterly subjective, utterly random. And I was reminded with your comment at the very beginning about shifting the focus to human. I was reminded that we have a huge debate in your economic issue today about whether corporations are people or not. In fact, apparently that debate has been ended. They are people. But Bill Moyer said something wonderful the other day. He says, we'll know that's true when Texas executes a corporation.
So I have some questions, but I'm wondering if first you have questions for each other. Did anything come up for you?
Well, I think that I would like to just sort of address the search research issue, because I think that one of the issues that we're dealing with in general now with the availability of so many media resources is a disjunction or the necessity to somehow bring together information and experience. Mm-hmm. That we have a tremendous amount, we can gather a tremendous amount of information, but to reconcile that with experience, that's where I see the role of research or searching, which is the same thing. But it's actually the need to connect these things, and that there's the gap, I think, between information, ways in which we understand and know our world through information and through experience are becoming, the gap between these is getting ever wider. And that the role, in a way, of education and what we do, any kind of creative endeavor, actually, is in some way involved with trying to reconcile those two, or at least bring them into discussion with each other, to acknowledge the fact that there is this huge gap, and that it's very difficult to mediate.
Yeah, I was entranced by Eve's tracing the crisis back to 1922 and then periodically erupting every 10 years. I would trace it back even further. You know, we all know that Martin Van Buren made some mistakes in the banking industry and led to the depression that gave birth to Ralph Waldo Emerson. But Emerson is constantly talking about the crisis in American education. You know, it's what self-reliance, this unbelievable poem of an essay is about. It's what his, the essay we call The American Scholar is about. All of these themes in which Emerson says, you know, books are for a scholar's idle times and things like that. And he's worried about the contagion of books. And he's writing, again, in that sort of depression moment. But another of his great words is experience. He's one of the poets of that word. One of the writers who nails that word into our public mind. And the weird little handyman who grew up making pencils, Henry David Thoreau, has his own sort of weird back to the land experiment of one sort of, you know, I can live in a scarcity economy with 9 rows of beans and some bricks I made and my copy of the Iliad. But that sense of crisis is so deep in those guys. You know, the 1830s, the 1840s, the American economy is in shambles. Poverty is everywhere, and these two lunatics are trying to sort of, you know, sort it out with crisis experiment words. I love this idea of America being the place of the place of old zero.
Old zero. Yeah.
That's right.
Yes. Copyright Olivia Grace Burns. Yeah.
That's right.
I think it'll go back farther than all of that. It will. All of these crises. It's I made a film on baseball. It takes something completely outside of this, but completely in it. And I found a quote from a guy named Pete O'Brien in 1857, who said, they don't play baseball the way they used to when I was a kid. I know they still play it with the same rules, but it's just lost the same. I mean, that is the nature of narrative. It is the undertow, the backwash of constructing a narrative, superimposing that sort of frame around a chaotic set of events, is that inevitably you're forced back into historical reflection, and you come and you begin to triangulate your position, and you see that it's not all perfect, as it never is, because we're all going to die. And so we're all trying to figure out a way to keep that wolf from the door. And what we tend to do, and the reason why I said head up the ass before is because I think what we have become, particularly in the academy, is so dialectically preoccupied that we focus on distinction. And that gets back to the elemental aspects of search and research, which, by the way, Hampshire College, we know this for 41 years, the difference between search and research. That's the whole reason why this place was founded. And so that's in our DNA. But everything's red state or blue state. Everything's black or white, gay or straight, young or old, male or female, whatever it is. We're always making distinctions because that's part of the process of narrative construction. Because if it can be one thing, then it can't be the other. If I Google search through this labyrinth, I'm going this way, I've chosen that road. If I have a GPS, I don't have to know about all the other routes. I just know how to get from there. And that becomes, as you're suggesting, is real surrogate experience. And we've got to find some other way in which the humanities can ignite, as Emerson hoped to do, a rebirth of that kind of energy of narrative, of story, and of self-examination. And then you have, as he says in that great essay on self-reliance, to do whatever inly rejoices. He made up that word, inly rejoices. Four-letter word. It's a fantastic word.
Okay, so that actually leads to one of the questions that I had, which I was thinking about this yesterday when I was talking with some of my Division III students. We were talking about this upcoming panel and some of the questions we might ask. And of course, they have great questions, which we'll get to in just a bit. But I was thinking about this question of research. And we're all historians, right? So you know what I mean when I say that there's that moment, and I got this from Tafuri as well, when you're putting the puzzle pieces together and suddenly they fit and you have aha, right? And it's this deeply fulfilling emotion. But I think one of the things about Google and the need to de-search is that sometimes you get there too fast. So I'm wondering, is Google depriving future generations of that deeply fulfilling aha? Yeah.
Absolutely. People come up to us and they say, man, you must have so many researchers. And we say, we don't have any. Like, we do it ourselves, right? We find the still photographs. We find the people. It's just a small nucleus of people because it isn't a Googleable event. And that synthesis of good story is just that. And what's so funny about it is that aha is then followed immediately by recognition, right? Because it's all, in some ways, Aristotelian poetic. So you suddenly arrive at, oh, yeah, that's fitting together nicely. And then it obeys certain laws that human beings have just figured out over the millennia to tell those stories, to keep the wolf from the door. But those are the moments that are getting fewer and farther between, it seems.
Okay, so then the follow-up to that is, if crisis is inherent to history, and we're kind of losing that aha moment, right? What then replaces it? Is history itself going to change? Is the practice of history and the humanities going to change? Or is critical inquiry going to change?
I don't think so. I think Lewis Mumford, one of his first acknowledgments is that a period in American letters and arts that we considered rather a dull period. The Brown decades, they were called, were in fact this vibrant period of great search and real American regeneration. And so, yeah, I mean, the absence of that aha is a kind of whatever. And then you begin to accept and you settle down and there's a kind of ennui. But the stories go on. You know, history is, you know, everything that came before this moment, this moment. So it's going to be pushing up whether you're paying attention or not.
I would say that the thing about history is that it's not necessarily a thing. And that it's actually a way of thinking. And that it's a kind of, it's a way of thinking critically. It's a way of learning how to sift through all that information. That is, there's sensory information, and then there's digital information, and there's all of this stuff. And that history is actually a way in which you think about problems that are current, problems that are social, problems that are philosophical, and that and that when we're, you know, writing history or producing history, it's a process. It's not really, there is no such thing as history, I guess.
No, there's not.
We make it, we produce it, we think about it, we criticize it, and that it's, what it is that critical mode of thinking that helps you figure out, you know, what is worth something and what is not, what is important and what is not, and whether something, I mean, I actually think that the, you know, the internet and the availability of so much information is a wonderful opportunity, actually. But I think that we need to learn how to discriminate. We need to use it critically. And if we can use it critically, then it's a tremendous resource. And I think that one can't, I mean, we can't be Luddites about this because it's here. And I don't think we want to go back in any way to some earlier condition where things seem to be less complex, as we've all been saying. At every moment, it's overwhelmingly complex, and we look back to a time that seemed simpler. So I think that, I mean, one of the other things that I found really interesting about what you were talking about with the, you know, the economic depression, that everything came out of the depression, that these economic crises are pretty good too, actually, for making us think in a new way about things. And it was interesting, in a class last week, one of my students said, as we were talking about utopian projects by architects that were sort of rethinking the whole world and society, things like the Garden City and so on. And why do people sort of turn to, and the discussion in the magazines and so forth is all about art. It's suddenly away from the technology of architecture to the art of architecture, and that art has become important. And she said, you know, is there some connection between economic crisis and the turning to art? And in fact, as we then, you know, argy-bargied about it in the class, it seemed that, yes, there is, because we look to art and we look to the humanities for a kind of thinking that sort of alternative futures, a creative way of thinking about the issues that are facing us. And they involve looking backward, looking forward, and all that kind of thing. But that the humanities are extremely important in moments like this for figuring out what is actually going on.
You know, there was a past crisis, not anywhere near this 30, 40 years ago, and I remember trying to raise money for a film, and I met an executive at then AT&T, who, very high executive, who was bemoaning all of these newly minted MBAs that could do the math but had no thing. He said, I'd be happy to teach a humanities person the math
Yeah.
and have their critical thinking, which is exactly what you're saying, the kind of GPS that history represents for the moment, the possibility to triangulate and fix more precisely where we are right now is one of the aspects of history, which is not a thing, but a set of critical thinking.
You know, it's interesting. You just remind me of something that I think it was in the late 70s, maybe it was in the early 80s, that in another moment of economic crisis, that there were new programs in business schools for regrooving PhDs for business. And you could take a quickie business course because they figured that people who had gone through that whole process of PhD and humanities and writing and thinking and blah, are way ahead of the game, and that the stuff that they need to know to go into business is actually not that
much,
not
Right.
that complicated.
Learn it quick.
And it was a really interesting program, and a number of people went through this sort of retooling PhDs for business, and I think it's a great idea, actually.
Well, except you've actually led right into one of my questions, and this is something I kind of can't sort out myself how I feel about this. But when school districts are arguing for keeping the arts in place, the argument is always, but businessmen need to be creative thinkers. Or, the reason we want to emphasize the humanities is so that we can all be good economists, right? But I think there's something about that turns the arts and the humanities into a service. And that makes me very, very uncomfortable. And, I think I don't want to do what I do to make sure that I'm making better doctors or businessmen or entrepreneurs. But then the problem is, okay, so where does it go then? If people don't actually make art or don't study history, then we have a world without music, without film, without, if it's just a service. And of course, that would be not a good place. But the other part of that then, though, is am I arguing for a specialization, which goes back to a little bit what Ken was talking about. So where do you go with that? I mean...
When I was a kid, I tried to play the viola pretty seriously, and I always got pretty good tone, but I remember the quartet's coach said, "You just can't count." So I think what we need is an approach to education where someone like me would have been told, "You need to learn some bookkeeping, and then you might learn how to be a good violist." I think that's what we, maybe a little time in business would teach you how to know the difference between triplets and 30-second notes.
I immediately thought, Karen, of John Adams, who said that I study war and politics so that my children might study commerce and industry so that my grandchildren might study music and art. That maybe the apotheosis of human pursuit might not be that MBA and the business, but the humanities and art, and not this sort of addendum that we plead for all the time. I end up on Capitol Hill once every couple of years pleading for the very existence of public broadcasting and the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, and it's just, you make the same argument over and over again, that they don't have anything to do with defending the country, they just make the country worth defending,
right.
Period.
I thought you were talking about the other John Adams. So.
Oh, that John.
So I wonder, should we turn the...
Yeah.
Okay, so let's
So
turn
patient.
over to questions from the audience.